Hey there guys, here in front of me I have a interesting system from AOC. If you don't know who AOC is, you might have heard of their monitors before. And if you've never heard of them, you might have actually heard of Ace Magic here. See, what this is this is actually a collaboration between AOC and Ace Magic to make a mini PC. So this is the AOC AM16, and we're pretty much just going to jump in and take a look at what exactly this collaboration was even about. And if you're wondering, I did not pay for this system myself. AOC actually reached out to me and sent it as a review sample, and I'm actually really surprised they even did that considering the history that I have with Ace Magic, but it's nice to see that they're willing to send it out and actually have it be reviewed. But that does not mean I'm going to give it any unnecessary charitability because of that, as I have quite a few criticisms of this system already without even getting my hands on it. And well, the key thing to all of that is the fact that this is rocking a Ryzen 7 5700U. This is an APU that released all the way back in 2021. And even though it is pretty old at this point, there are still brand new systems coming out that have this APU in it. So we're already pretty familiar with the kind of performance we should expect out of a system like this. And my main issue is really just the fact that in 2024, this is becoming kind of a problem. So let's just jump right on in and actually see what this can do in 2024. But first, this video is brought to you by Instant Gaming, the #1 source for great deals on some of today's most popular game titles. And to celebrate this new partnership, we're hosting a giveaway. So by clicking the link down below, you can sign up for your chance to win any game out of the Instant Gaming catalog, and it is an extensive catalog. If you guys are like me, you're always on the lookout for great deals on games, because at the end of the day, games are very expensive, and if you can save 10, 20, 30, 40, or even all the way up to 90% on some titles, why wouldn't you do it? Check out the link down below. Thank you to Instant Gaming for sponsoring this video. Taking a look at what we actually get in the box, it's pretty much the standard stuff that comes with every mini PC. We get a VESA mount bracket, we get the power adapter, we get an HDMI, and we get some spare screws, most likely for mounting an extra SSD. The power adapter is also 65 watts, which is pretty standard for systems with this configuration. And the I/O is also pretty standard and unremarkable for systems with these specs. We're looking at 2 USB 2.0 ports, 2 HDMI ports, 1 gigabit LAN port, and the power DC port. It's certainly not awful and in line with most other systems with this hardware, but the problem is that at the price point that this is at right now, there are better systems with the same hardware, because there are systems that have dual gigabit or 2.5 gigabit at the same price point or cheaper. If we take a look at the front I/O, we're looking at 2 USB 3.0 ports, and we have a USB Type-C along with the audio port and of course the power button. In general, the system actually has a interesting design where it has this non-symmetrical top design here that is kind of just a lid that also has a little bit of stylizing to it, just to give it a kind of distinct look. Overall, I'm a fan of it. I do think that it looks nice in comparison to most other mini PCs out there, but the entire plastic construction kind of overall brings down the quality in general, and the large AOC stamping at the top is kind of gaudy in comparison to B-Link and in particular Minisform, which seem to have systems that are a little less flashy, at least when it comes to the logos. In general, pretty normal I/O for most mini PCs with this hardware, but again, you could get systems like the Boss Game P1, which actually has the exact same CPU. It also has 32 gigabytes of RAM, and that comes with a 1 terabyte SSD, and at least going off of right now Amazon pricing, it's $80 cheaper than this is. And you might think to yourself, you don't need 2.5 gigabit LAN, but at this point, 2.5 gigabit is so cheap that I genuinely cannot see a reason why you would want to spend more to get less. You more than likely within the next 5 years will have a home network that can do 2.5 gigabit, considering that now even ISPs are giving people routers that can handle faster networking like that. So having a system that you buy today that can actually support that kind of networking is just going to give it a much longer lifespan. And especially if you're a fan of using these little systems as home servers, I practically think that 2.5 gigabits is necessary. When you're just one person using a home server, 1 gigabit is perfectly fine. But once you have multiple systems that at any moment could be hitting a server at the same time, suddenly 1 gigabit can be pretty limiting. With a 2.5 gigabit home server, you could essentially have 2 full gigabit connections using that system, and you'd still have 500 megabits of bandwidth left over for any other system that needs to access it but not really use the full bandwidth. So suddenly you go from a scenario where you're limited by 1 gigabit connection, potentially using the entirety of the bandwidth, to essentially letting 2 full systems do that and still have some overhead for $80 less money. Again, I just really feel like the lack of 2.5 gigabit at this price point is kind of insane. But let's move on to the rest of the system. But okay, so I just finished all of the testing that I was going to do on this system, and before I go in and talk about numbers and everything like that, one thing I do really want to point out about this system is I'm really impressed by just how quiet it is, and I appreciate that it's also configured to use a reasonable amount of TDP. So while running Cinebench R23 from the wall, we were only pulling 44 watts. And that's because it has a TDP configuration of about 25 watts. Now, just so you know, the TDP that you set is not telling it how much watts it's actually going to use from the wall, because obviously other components in the system are also going to need power. It's pretty much just how much power the CPU itself could use, or rather the APU, since in this case both the CPU and the iGPU are going to have to share the power load. If we want to talk about CPU performance in general, it pretty much falls in line with all the other 5700U systems. I do appreciate how quiet it is in comparison to some of the systems that configure a higher out-of-the-box TDP. But in general, most systems with the 5700U tend to be pretty quiet. There are only a few exceptions, specifically GMK Tech's offerings tend to be pretty loud in comparison to B-Link. Really, the most impressive thing about the AOC to me is that even though it's not a top fan ventilated system, it actually does perform pretty admirably in comparison to B-Link's offerings, which tend to be some of the quietest on the market, just due to the fact that that top fan is actually able to breathe so much better than any of these systems that have side ventilation. But being a quiet system isn't really the only thing that matters, obviously. The performance is what matters, and while it falls in line with other 5700U systems, well, it falls in line with other 5700U systems. That means it's not doing anything remarkable, and we're talking about an APU that is over 3 years old at this point. So now that question becomes, is the 5700U really worth getting in 2024? Well, I can tell you right now, at the price point that this is at currently on the market right now, looking on Amazon, the cheapest system I can see is $500, but that's with a $100 coupon, which means that its actual price is $400. At $400, it's pretty much dead on arrival. As I mentioned before, you could get a Boss Game P1 for $320, or you could even get a B-Link Sur 5 Pro for the same $320, but you're getting half as much memory as either the P1 or this specific system. But even then, both the P1 and the Sur 5 come with 1 terabyte SSD, as opposed to just the 512 that are on this system. 512 can be pretty limiting in 2024, especially with just the size of games in general. And it's not just top of the line games, because for the vast majority of people, you're not really going to even attempt to play those on these kinds of systems, since they don't really perform well enough that anyone would find it enjoyable enough. But even indie games and smaller titles that actually run pretty well on low-end hardware are starting to get pretty large in size. And with games being 15 to 20 gigabytes on the low end, suddenly 512 gigabytes will fill up pretty quickly. So I always feel like 1 terabyte should be about the minimum that you get on these mini PCs, unless you're on the really budget end of the market, where you're looking at buying an N95, N97, or N100 based processor based mini PC. And even that GMK Tech system that I mentioned before that was louder than this, at least that came with dual 2.5 gigabit NICs, which means that you get a system that lets you actually manage your home network, and this comes out to be even cheaper than all the other systems. And this, of course, also isn't taking into account that it's competing with the Beelink Surf 5 Max as well, because that comes in at $360. And with that, you get the 5800H, which is a generation newer. So you're going from Zen 2 to Zen 3. So there's a pretty major IPC uplift that happens there. We're also going from a U series processor to an H series. So our TDP actually ends up going from 25 watts all the way up to 54 watts. But with that, we see a pretty massive increase in the CPU performance there. Pair that with the same 32 gigabytes of RAM and also the same 512 gigabyte SSD, and you pretty much end up with a system that is all around better, at least in terms of pure performance. Of course, the Surf 5 Max's biggest weakness is that it is a very loud system, since it's taking a chassis that was designed for much lower TDPs and really pushing it to its limits. And while I really like the Surf 5 Max, I can understand the noise being an issue, but that's when the P1 just exists. And the P1 is really just the thing that absolutely stomps this thing out of existence, because the P1 really just matches it spec for spec, except it beats it out when it comes to that 2.5 gigabit LAN. And that really makes it the killer feature when you're spending $80 less as well. And of course, I am not even mentioning the system that really comes in and absolutely mollywops the hell out of this system, and that is the Beelink Surf 6. Specifically the 2024 refresh. Now, Beelink never has sent me a review sample since the S12 Mini, so I pretty much have to buy all Beelink systems, so I haven't gotten my hands on the new 2024 Surf 6. But at least from Iceberg Tech's video, it seems to perform exactly where a 6900HX system should be performing, and considering you can pick that system up right now on Amazon for $390, but that's with 16 gigabytes of RAM and 500 gigabytes of storage. Not exactly a extremely compelling offer if you ask me, just because I feel like the 6900HX would really benefit from 32 gigabytes of RAM, and I do think that 500 gigabytes of SSD storage is just not enough, especially for a system that is starting to get up there in price. But considering that that's still $10 cheaper than this system is, it really is just a whole different world in terms of performance. I really don't want to make you sit here and look at more performance benchmarks with the 5700U just because we've covered it so much, but I will show some newer titles that I just have played on there recently. That way there's at least a little bit more value there. I'm not going to show any of the usual benchmark games, just because if you want to see how those perform, pretty much look at any of the other videos that I've done with the 5700U as the main feature, because this falls squarely in line with all of those in terms of testing. Just out of habit, I did run those numbers and I do have the footage for it, but I feel bad just showing you guys a chip that we've looked at so many times. It would be like doing yet another video on the 5500U. I don't know if I could realistically get away with another one of those unless it's going to be a video where I'm essentially saying this is the last look at the 5500U, kind of like how I want to say this is my last look at the 5700U. So let's just jump in and take a look at some of those numbers, and I'll even show you what it compares to when we look at it against the Surf 6. So the first game that I took a look at is Abiotic Factor, and it was running at 1080p with the lowest in-game graphics settings, and I'm pretty sure it has some form of upscaling, but it doesn't really matter because no matter what configuration I went with, it just did not perform well on here. Even though this game is designed to look like Half-Life, it's misleading because this is running on the Unreal 5 engine. See, just because the Unreal 5 engine is a new engine doesn't mean every game made on it is going to be these ultra high quality, ultra high resolution games, but it is going to still utilize the Unreal 5 rendering pipeline, and if it's just something that is too demanding for this old APU, well, it's going to fall apart, and that's exactly what's happening here, where this system is just not able to keep up with a title that is this modern. And that's going to be a worrying trend with this APU going through the rest of 2024, especially as it seems like integrated graphics are going to see another massive leap in performance, and an APU like this is really going to start to fall behind at a far more noticeable level. Another game that I wanted to take a look at is Nightingale, which is in a similar vein to Abiotic Factor. It is a survival game, and also like Abiotic, it actually runs on the Unreal 5 engine, and we end up in a similar situation here. And similarly, we're not using FSR, we're using the temporal upscaling that is built into the Unreal 5 engine, and it tends to do a better job performance-wise than FSR 2.0 does on these older APUs, but visually speaking, the game is really rough. Even this really aggressive upscaling is just not enough to get this to be at a playable level, and walking around, you're going to see that not only is our performance awful, but because of the really aggressive upscaling, everything looks disgusting, especially the ocean. And while you're trying to look away in horror at that, you might notice these absolutely disgusting spectral deer that are just running across the screen. The amount of ghosting is so severe, it pretty much makes them all into a blur. Of course, that's not where the problems end for a system like this. Here with Lords of the Fallen, I'm trying to launch the game, and it immediately gave me this warning about my drivers because they are out of date. It wants me to be at least one update ahead of where I'm at. Unfortunately, Vega is just no longer prioritized in terms of driver releases, and definitely not for driver optimization. So the latest version that we can be on is 24.3.1, which is already an unexpected release because that came after 3 months of no updates for Vega-based iGPUs. And of course, once I actually just launched the game telling it to ignore this warning, I end up getting another one telling me that I can't use MSI Afterburner. Already some issues there, but we'll power through. Finally, after loading in here, the performance and visuals both actually ended up being more impressive than I expected them to be. That's not to say that they're good by any means. Things look pretty awful. There's ghosting in any kind of movement whatsoever. In general, it does look pretty bad. But the performance numbers are higher than I was expecting them to be, though. Playing the actual game, you can very clearly tell that the 1% lows are not at around the 30 FPS average that we're getting here. Those 1% lows are very clearly hitting the teens and single digits, just moving around. And this is a consistent problem. Now, I can't tell you the 1% lows or the full FPS averages, but what I can say is that with such aggressive graphics settings, we're still not really able to get much of a decent experience, and I'm mostly just impressed with the fact that this wasn't absolutely disastrous visually speaking. It's just bad. And look, I get it, I've been throwing some pretty heavy titles at it, and a lot of really modern ones, so I decided to try out one that I was hoping would actually give me a better result than what I got, and that is Scum. We are running this with the lowest in-game graphics settings, and we are using FSR for upscaling here. We are using the ultra quality preset for it to try to maximize that performance, and we're still not even able to get a 30 FPS average. Keep in mind, this game initially came out all the way back in 2018. It's been around for a while, but of course it isn't exactly the most optimized title, as you could probably tell by the genre that it's in. And I realize we've taken a look at pretty much nothing but survival games, but that's kind of been what I've been playing a lot lately, outside of course Lords of the Fallen. But let's jump into some comparisons, because what I really want to emphasize is you see the performance here, and let me show you what exactly is out there on the market right now for a similar price that actually right now as I'm recording this is actually cheaper by about $20. See, we're going to be comparing it to this boss game E3, but not necessarily because the boss game itself is at a great price, though it is very competitive, because you could find essentially its sibling, the Sur 6 2024 refresh, for $20 cheaper than this 5700U system. Now, of course, a key aspect to this is the fact that with the 2024 re-release of the Sur 6, essentially the refresh, we do actually see them move from a metal body to, unfortunately, a plastic one. That is also similar to the P3 here. Again, they're made by the same company, so they're effectively going to be extremely similar, and Of course, the specs here line up pretty much identically with the Sur 6 2024 refresh. So the comparison numbers that we get from this are going to be pretty much in line with what we would get with a Sur 6 2024. So the first of the comparison games that I wanted to take a look at is a weird one. It's Metro Last Light, the original game, but it is running with its most demanding graphics settings. So everything is turned up to its highest, including the tessellation, which goes to such high levels that even in modern hardware, it can be ridiculously demanding. Keep in mind, this actually doesn't give really any noticeable visual increase in any capacity. I just really wanted to push these things to their limit, and it's one of the only games with a built-in benchmark that will do that without being such a disaster of a slideshow. But here we do end up seeing a 63.6% increase in our FPS average and a 53.3% increase in our 1% lows. Now, neither game is running really all that well here, though there is a noticeable difference with the 6900HX here. Keep in mind, this game will run absolutely beautifully on either one of these systems if you actually set it to correct settings and not something ridiculous like this. But it should show you what the gap in performance is going to look like here, and this is well within that spec that we should expect, which is almost always going to be around a baseline of 50%. But the problem with trying to average performance increases across a wide variety of different titles is the fact that, well, some games just end up seeing huge increases in performance. For example, here, Mountain Blade Bannerlord running with the lowest in-game graphics settings sees a massive 185.4% increase in our FPS average, which is an already impressive result, but it's made even more impressive when we end up getting a 220% increase in our 1% lows, bringing them from just a range of 30 all the way up to 96. We were 4 frames away from our 1% lows being triple digits. And keep in mind, you are saving $20 with going with the 6900HX system. And look, one thing that is very apparent across a wide variety of games is that going from the lowest graphics settings to medium usually ends up having the largest jump in visual quality in comparison to going from medium to ultra. This isn't always the case with every game, but in the vast majority of them, that does end up being the case. And what this system here actually lets you do in comparison to the 5700U system is that we can now turn up the graphics all the way up to medium. You can see, visually speaking, there is just a lot more detail in everything, but we still get a 111.5% increase in our FPS average and a 126.3% increase in our 1% lows. That brings something that is an unplayable gaming experience up to a range where it's going to be perfectly acceptable for the vast majority of people. And the benefit is that you actually get a visual result that is going to be a lot closer to what people are getting with full dedicated gaming systems rather than just a mini PC like this. More than likely, if you looked at a screenshot of this game that was at medium graphics settings and at ultra, you're probably going to have to look really hard to find the actual detailed differences between the two in comparison to looking at the lowest graphics settings next to medium. And to demonstrate the difference in terms of esports titles, here we have Rainbow Six Siege running with the lowest in-game graphics settings, but this time around we're using FSR at the ultra quality preset. This is FSR 2.0. Visually speaking, this is one of the best results that you can possibly get using FSR while still getting a nice little bump in your FPS, and that still ended up giving us a massive 83% increase in our FPS average and a still massive 73.1% increase in our 1% lows, bringing us from a below 60 FPS average, though a very consistent one considering that 41 1% lows on an FPS average of 47 means that that's still going to be a very, very smooth 47. But when you look at it compared to 1% lows of 71 and an FPS average of 86, that is going to be a much smoother gaming experience. If you have a high refresh rate display, well, you can actually take advantage of it. So I hope those comparisons there at the end kind of just really show you what my main gripe with this system is. At $400, this is a ridiculous system to buy. There is just no reason to get a 5700U, which in today's market is no longer being driver supported by AMD. It is just significantly weaker than the current generations of iGPUs, and AOC partnered with AceMagic here have just pushed this at a price point that just does not make any sense for anyone out there. I'm very curious what AOC has to benefit from this partnership with AceMagic, because this isn't the only system that they're working on together. They actually have multiple different lines of mini PCs, and they even have some laptops that are effectively just AceMagic systems that get an AOC logo slapped on them instead of AceMagic, Ace PC, Ace Magician, or whatever other sub brand they are using nowadays. I don't want you to get the impression that it's a bad product per se. The system itself is competent enough, though doesn't do anything unique within its own actual performance category, that I really just don't see a reason to get this over anything from B-Link, Minis Forum, GMK Tech, or any of the other brands out there, considering that they are just a lot more price competitive and come with overall better features. Again, the Boss Game P1 is the main system that puts this to shame, because of the fact that we get a cool, quiet system similar to this one that can actually run at a higher TDP while still remaining cool and quiet. It comes with 2.5 gigabit LAN, and the overall construction of the system does feel higher quality than this. And of course, that's if you want to save $80, which I don't really see a reason to do that when you can just save $20 and get yourself a system that is giving you sometimes almost 3 times the performance. Even in the absolute worst case scenarios where I've only seen around a 30% performance jump, that's still a 30% performance jump for an extra $60 over the P1, or for $20 less than this. There's just no reason for this to exist in the market currently. It would really need to drop down all the way into the sub $300 price range for me to actually consider this. And the reason being is just the limited IO, but I know for me personally, 2.5 gigabit is kind of just bare minimum for mini PCs at this price category, because other companies are doing it at a better price. So there's no reason to get gigabit, there's no reason to have such limited IO, and there's no reason for this to be $400 in 2024. A very odd move from AOC. I'm very curious to see how long this partnership with AceMagic is even going to go on for. Can't imagine that a monitor brand is all that interested in going very hard into the mini PC market, but considering the massive growth we've seen within mini PC communities in the last couple of years, well, maybe AOC is onto something, but I really think that they missed the mark heavily here with an unremarkable system at a price point that is laughable. I'll catch you guys in the next one.